back to Haunted and Historic Australia. Due to lockdown, we've not been able to get out and do our paranormal investigations. In the interim, we do have some episodes of criminals, cutthroats, and convicts to share with you. Our first episode was Thomas Barrett, the first man hung in Australia, and our second episode, The Hangman, James Freeman. Please enjoy these episodes while we're in lockdown, and as soon as we're back to normal, we'll get out there and start doing our paranormal investigations again. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe and enjoy these episodes. If we go back to 1788, we know of another man, 20-year-old James Freeman. No more than 2 days after Thomas was hung for robbery of the government rations, James made an attempt to steal flour with another man, William Shearman, to make a pudding. Greed, hunger seemed to be their motive. James, born approximately 1768, the youngest of 6 to poor parents, his father dying when he was only 18 months of age, which indicates how being of a poor family in desperate economic times caused the children, like so many others, to live a life of stealing to survive. This led to James growing up and joining a gang in his teens, and that gang turning to highway robbery. For 12 shillings they were caught, and James was found guilty on 3rd of March 1784 at 16 years of age. He was sentenced to death at the Old Bailey, then reprieved for transportation. Initially held in a hulk named Justitia, he remained there until he was selected to be transported to Botany Bay aboard the Alexander on 17th of May 1787, along with the Charlotte and 9 other ships. They arrived and, like Thomas, on board the Charlotte, embarked after being taken into Port Jackson. It seems strange that so many convicts attempted to steal after Governor Phillip warned that if they tried to steal from the governor's rations, it was punishable by death, and Thomas had now been hung. Could they have believed that after cheating death a few times now and being transported, that they really wouldn't be put to death? Either way, Thomas Barrett hung on the 27th of February, and he was James on the 29th, robbing the store. They made away with the flour but were caught shortly after, James being caught with it in his possession. He said that he had been given the flour, but the other man, William Shearman, had said he'd stolen it. Both were marched to Gallows Hill immediately, and to the tree where Thomas mounted the ladder and left this life. It is not known if James witnessed Thomas' demise in person, but it is undoubted that he would have heard about it. 2 other men, Daniel Gordon and John Williams, were also at the tree to be hung for stealing wine. So clearly the message wasn't getting through of the repercussions if they were that desperate. There they stood at Gallows Hill awaiting certain death, although 3 other men had only been sent to Pitchgut Island. Maybe they would not be hung. They were all chained together to ensure other convicts were made to feel intimidated. The soldiers were fully armed with bayonet, musket, fife and drum. They were really hoping that they may be saved. But time was ticking. Reverend Johnson was now giving them the last rites. Was there any hope? James, now with the noose around his neck, waited. Drums were pounding, his heart also pounding. Luckily, the judge advocate came rushing in. "Stop," he said, perhaps no longer wanting to lose any more of his First Fleet convicts that could be used for labour. The declaration was read. James Freeman was spared, so long as he undertook the role of hangman, the public executioner, and it would be for the remaining of his term, which by this time was only another 3 years. Should he decline, the Marines were ordered to shoot him. James quickly agreed, as aware there was no choice in the matter. The noose was removed. Although he may not have fully understood or taken in the reality of what was being asked of him, he would now be responsible for taking lives. James was the first convict to have a conditional pardon in writing. He was chosen as he was young, strong, and good stature, required for a good hangman. It was not long before James was forced to complete his first act in the position of hangman. As Governor Phillip had declared in April 1788 that there would be no more pardons. Any further theft would be met with death, an immediate hanging. 2nd of May 1788, a young man, the same age as James, was caught stealing from the store. It was John Bennett, age 20, caught stealing, and it wasn't his first offence, but his fourth. Originally captured in England and tried at Shropshire on 18th of March 1786 for robbing a box of buttons from a wagon, sentenced to death, then reprieved to the Dunkirk hulk. Although the same hulk that Thomas Barrett was in, he was not selected to board the Charlotte, but instead was placed on the ship Friendship. On the voyage, he got into trouble for stealing provisions on board the Friendship. He was found asleep in a longboat, used for transporting heavy loads to and from the ship. John, once found, was flogged 37 lashes for breaking out of his iron and stealing the food. A lieutenant on board the Friendship, Ralph Clark, recorded this in his diary. A young man, but an old rogue. Mark my words, that he will not have been at Botany Bay 6 months before this young villain comes to the gallows. Lieutenant Ralph Clark was right on the money. Just after embarking at Port Jackson, just days after the governor's message, it is written that on the 15th of February 1788, John was caught stealing food again. He was flogged yet again on the 15th of February, only weeks before Thomas Barnett was hung. Now surely John would know about Thomas's hanging, and then James Freeman only a few days later becoming the hangman, and the rest of the men being sent to Pinchgut also. Surely this would stop John from even thinking about stealing anything else. But no, John Bennett was in trouble again. He had broken into one of the Charlotte's tents and stolen property and food. What could possibly have driven John to go into the tents set up near the Charlotte and steal? He knew what the consequences were. In April, Governor Phillip made sure everybody was fully aware that the next thieving from the rations or any thieving would be punishable by death, by hanging. They had James Freeman ready to go. I wonder what drove John to do this. It must have been very tough times in the colony. On the 2nd of May, he was caught, tried, and led to James Freeman at the tree at Gallows Hill. I can only imagine how both boys would have been thinking. John, who was about to meet his end, and James, who was the one who was going to end him. From what we know of the journals detailing the moments of John's confession, included that it was due to his idleness and bad connection that he knew in time he would be caught and of his fate. One positive for John, that James was there. We also read from journals of eyewitnesses, David Collins, the judge advocate, and John White, the surgeon, that James did his job well. When it was time, John was hung, and it was quick, unlike what we hear of poor Thomas, who had to mount the ladder himself, put the noose around his own neck when the ladder was kicked out. Without a hangman, at the time struggled before succumbing to the noose. This site, Gallows Hill, was also now known as Hangman's Hill. It is not known where the bodies of those men ended up. Thomas is said to have been buried near the tree at the gallows. There are a few places we hear and we've learned that were used, although no official records kept until 1791. James must not have felt well after the hanging of John Bennett. It was not to be his last. On the 28th of June, 2 men were brought before him. Samuel Peyton, 20, and Edward Corbett, only a few years older. Samuel Peyton was hung for stealing shirts, stockings, and combs. He had arrived on the Alexander. He was a skilled stonemason who taught others his craft. He is also mainly responsible for the establishing of the quarry at Bennelong Point. He was caught stealing out of the lieutenant's tent. He was able to send a letter to his mother before his execution. The other man, Edward Corbett, also of the Alexander, his alias, Edward Cormick, had stolen a frock and run off into the bush to avoid being caught. In his rush to get away, he let out 4 cows and 2 bulls that he was in charge of herding. They ran off and were not recovered. In the bush, it is learned he met with Aboriginals. Some offered him food, but later found others who would do him harm. He noticed that there was a convict who'd been beheaded and his body was on a fire. Being almost starved and exhausted, he surrendered on the 23rd, also having experienced the earthquake that had been noted down on the 22nd of June. This may also have prompted him to turn back to the settlement. Another couple of young men, what a waste of life. It must have been such a strange time for so many to be stealing. There was most likely more going on amongst the convicts themselves. This life was in their blood. But what a risk. James had a few months' breather before the next life he had to end, or turn off, as they said in the day. James Daly, another young convict, was the third of the convicts James Freeman would have to hang. James Daly transported on the Scarborough for stealing back home. He, like the others, found himself in trouble again with the law in Sydney. Stealing again from another Lieutenant Kello and a Mr. Augustus Alt, a surveyor, it wasn't his first crime since arriving, as he was given 100 lashes in August of 1788 for pretending to discover gold. He gave the law the runaround before confessing that he made it up. But this time, stealing was going to see him hanged. And on the 3rd of December 1788, James Daly was turned off. Not before stating that 2 women had put him up to it and benefit greatly from the goods he had stolen. As James was hung, one of the women had her head shaved and made to wear a frock with the letters RSG, Receiver of Stolen Goods. She was paraded in front of the other convicts. She was told she'd be punished if she removed it. James Freeman had a Christmas and New Year without incident. All seemed in order until 27th of March 1789, where a Joseph Hunt, who was a Marine on the First Fleet Charlotte, confessed that he and 6 other Marines had been using their sentry duty as a cover and, being holders of a store key, were robbing the store on a series of raids. Apparently Joseph had felt too much guilt and turned king's evidence, or ratted on his pals and himself. But luckily for Joseph, as he had come clean, he was pardoned. But for the other 6 men, some of which had been involved in a mysterious death of another Marine, Thomas Bulmore, in November of 1788, James Baker, Richard Askey, Luke Haynes and Richard Dukes had all received 200 lashes in November for fights contributing to the death of Thomas Bulmore. This time, though, the men were joined by James Brown and Thomas Jones. Poor James Freeman must have thought the world had gone mad. Executing Marines? But an example had to be made that stealing was an offence punishable no matter who you were. It is said that the Marines had mainly stolen liquor. On 27th of March 1789, the following Marines were hung by James Freeman at the gallows, or Hangman's Hill: John Baker, Luke Haynes, Richard Dukes, Richard Askey, Thomas Jones and James Brown. I struggled to find an account through the journals about this, as John White's journal ended at the end of 1788. Perhaps it was quite the embarrassment for the colony to record such things. But the deed now done, it is possible that they were buried with the other Marines who had died since the arrival at Campbell's Ridge. It was yet another warning to the convicts and to anyone who thought about stealing in the colony. James must have been feeling ill, hanging 6 men in a row. Thankfully it was a while now till the next, but for James it would never get easier. This is the last thing that James would have wanted, to hang a woman. But it didn't take too long for one of the female convicts to get into trouble. Anne Davis was convicted at the Old Bailey on the 26th of April 1786 for stealing 8 pairs of stockings. She was captured in the possession near the house of James Atkinson, where she had stolen them. She was sentenced to 7 years' transportation to Australia aboard the Lady Penrhyn. Anne also had an alias she used, the name of Judith Jones. Anne was one of 101 female convicts that were transported to Australia in the First Fleet. There is no mention of Anne in 1788. We believe she was most likely under the radar, or at least not being caught. The first we hear of Anne is on the 3rd of January 1789, where she was acquitted in a court set up in front of Governor Phillip, Lieutenant Governor Ross, and the Judge Advocate David Collins. She had been accused of stealing another female convict's white shirt, the shirt of Mary Marshall, who had been given that shirt by a soldier who she had had relations with. The very next month, both women were in trouble again, Anne for creating a disturbance and Mary Marshall for using infamous expressions, most likely profanities or bad language. Both women were sentenced to flogging of 25 lashes each, which was not at all comfortable, which is perhaps why we don't hear about Anne again until November. On 14th of November 1789, Anne was found drunk and in the possession of many skirts, waistcoats and handkerchiefs, all items listed as missing from Robert Sidaway's house. Robert Sidaway was a convict at 24. He was indicted in September 1782 at the Old Bailey for grand larceny, stealing a large amount of clothing from many different people. Originally sentenced to death, then later to transportation, first to America. Failing this, due to the revolution, it was then to Australia. He must have sat in a hulk on the Thames from September 1782 until they left in 1787 May. The best part of 5 years of his sentence was spent in the hulks. Robert Sidaway travelled to Australia aboard the ship Friendship. It is noted that he was placed in leg irons after being rude to Lieutenant William Faddy, who was also on board the Friendship. Upon arriving in Sydney, we understand he was in relations with Mary Marshall and lived with her. It is noticed that Mary Marshall and Anne Davis both arrived in Sydney aboard the Lady Penrhyn. They must have had somewhat of a friendship, as Anne was often invited to spend time in their home and smoke pipe with them. Although all of this changed when Anne was found with the stolen goods from their house, possessions from both Robert and Mary. She had apparently broken in, knocked over a tub of water, and then stolen various items. We hear now again about the convict John Ryan, who was the lookout for Thomas Barrett and the other 3 men. John Ryan had been given the duty to watch over Robert Sidaway's house when Robert and Mary were out. But John locked up their house after being told that a man was being punished at the hospital. He ran off to see what was happening. He said he left a window open but definitely locked the door. On his return to the house, he noted that the door was left wide open and the window, a tub of water knocked over and various items missing. The mystery was soon to be solved when Anne was located with the items. Anne claimed that she had been given these items by another woman. This was quickly dismissed. She was found guilty and sentenced to death on the 21st of November. Anne, knowing that her time was near an end and how the colony so needed the birth of more children into the settlement, she quickly declared that she was pregnant, knowing that they would not dare hang a woman that was with child. A jury of 12 matrons among the convicts were brought together to decide undoubtedly if Anne were truly pregnant. Unable to prove or persuade the older female convicts that she was pregnant, one of the oldest of the matrons spoke out. The woman must have been 60 years of age. "Gentlemen, she is as much with child as I am." This sealed her fate. 30-year-old Anne was to be hung on the following Monday, the 23rd of November. By the Monday, wherever she had been kept or held until now, she had been allowed access to alcohol, as she was extremely intoxicated. She required 2 other women to assist her in walking to the gallows, and whilst James applied the noose, an account of this was recorded by a Jacob Nagle, a sailor and soldier who kept a diary of his adventures. When brought to gallows, leading by 2 women, she was so intoxicated in the liquor that she could not stand without holding her up. It was dreadful to see her going to eternity out of this world in such a senseless, shocking manner. If a soldier could be so shocked by the hanging of Anne Davis, it must have been most traumatising for James Freeman, who would bear witness and executor of this woman's end. It is widely noted that James was affected by the hanging of Anne, and possibly all of those by the noose. It all exploded in him. Some weeks after the hanging, the ordeal must have still been infecting his mind. On the 11th of December, James was found after hours, 10:45 p.m, out of his hut, inebriated, abusive and extremely out of sorts. After all, James was only 21 now, and still only a young man by today's standards. Even so, because of the state in which they found him, this earned him 100 lashings. He was to still hang more souls before he served his term as hangman. Thomas Sanderson, 10th of January 1790, hung for stealing by force flour, beef and pork from Thomas Steele and Joseph Bishop. William Chaff, who arrived in Sydney on the Charlotte on 14th of May 1789, sentenced to 150 lashes for stealing a pumpkin from another convict, John Archer. Then again, 20th of April 1790, he was discovered trying to steal from another convict, James Tennell. He was hung that day. Hugh Lowe, alias Chester Cartwright, arrived in Sydney on the Second Fleet. For stealing sheep on the 24th of August 1790, he was recorded as being well behaved after the wreck of the Guardian ship, in which collided with an iceberg. All convicts made it overboard, but some livestock was lost, and only what they could place on the Lady Juliana ship was recovered. He was sent a pardon from England by His Majesty, but it arrived a year after he was hung. James Chapman, who may have been the last of James Freeman's hangings, was hung on the 28th of July 1791 for breaking into the house of John Patry and taking a shirt. By July 1791, James Freeman had completed his 7-year term. No longer did he have to tie the noose and be the hangman. And just in time, for the Third Fleet had arrived, and with it a female convict by the name of Mary Edwards. They married in 1792 and had 2 daughters. The marriage did not last, and Mary married again. Unfortunately, their oldest daughter, Mary Freeman, died aged 8. It is unknown what the cause was. Their youngest daughter went on to have twins, in which she named her boy after her father James. James, unable to gain land and with no sons, he laboured hard from 1791, and at the age of 63 in 1830 was living in Richmond with a farmer, Thomas Miles, and his family. James died in Windsor Hospital and was buried in an unmarked grave at St Matthew's in Windsor. James could now rest, but he will be remembered as Australia's first hangman. Although remembered for not so nice a task, too many convicts are not remembered at all. They were thieving rascals, but they were the backbone of the settlement, and with their labour and farming, it began what Sydney is today. Thank you for joining us for The Hangman, James Freeman. We hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe, and look out for our next episodes.